Well, good morning and welcome back to the Broadcast Retirement Network. I'm Jeff Snyder, and this is BRN Weekly for Saturday, September 5th, 2020. And our top story today, assessing the impact of millions accessing their superannuation fund. Well, joining me now to discuss this and more is Dr. Michael Drew. He's a professor at Griffith University. He's also a trustee for one of the superannuation funds. Dr. Drew, Michael, thank you so much for joining us on the program this morning.
Jeff, good morning, and I trust you and yours and our friends in the United States are doing as well as they can at this time.
We're hanging in there. Thanks for your best wishes, and same to you and the folks in Australia. Let's jump right in, though, because you recently authored an op-ed piece for the Courier around the devastating effects of COVID-19 on retirement savings. Let's dive into it. What can you tell us? What were your thoughts here?
Yeah, we're getting more worried about COVID-19 shifting from a public health crisis to a looming retirement security issue for folks around the world. And as you know, in the United States, in Europe, in Australia, governments have loaded up an incredible amount of short-term support for workers and businesses. But it seems as though, certainly from our perspective, that retirement security-related issues have been something of an afterthought.
So in terms of, is there a particular group that is more impacted than others? For example, millennials or Gen Xers or maturing Australians?
Yeah, no, I think maybe during the GFC we saw the full brunt of that, global event on retirement balances for baby boomers. We're seeing now baby boomers impacted by this event, but also Gen X. So our research has shown that the workers on average accumulate about half of their retirement savings balance in the last decade of their life. So we're particularly concerned for those folks, say, in the last decade of their working life and maybe the first decade of the drawdown phase.
Yeah, and I think when we last spoke about 3 months ago, it was right at the beginning of the pandemic. You had mentioned that I think for the first time, members were able to take money out of their superannuation funds. Do you have a sense for what the actual volume of those types of transactions were? And I'm assuming that plays into the impact you're describing.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's been over $30 billion withdrawn in our system in the space of sort of essentially 3 months. So that's the first time in our history in Australia that we've allowed folks to withdraw from their DC savings. And talking now about the millennials, of course, it's impacted those sort of baby boomers, Gen X, but particularly for those who work in hospitality, tourism, any kind of sort of services that have a high casual labour force. Those accounts have been completely depleted. So there's a real debate in this country about what the down the road impacts will be, even for those as young as sort of 20 years old.
And in terms of, you brought attention to the matter with your op-ed. Any thoughts from public policymakers on what possibly can be done? I mean, if you don't have the retirement savings, you've either got to extend your work or you've got to find it from other sources. I mean, any thoughts from policymakers there in Australia?
Yeah, this is a real shift in our system. We've had a tradition since sort of the early 1990s of compulsion. So superannuation in Australia is not an opt-in or an opt-out. Employers must pay 9.5% of a worker's wage and salary into their DC plan, or we call it superannuation fund, at a minimum each quarter. So this is a real shift. It's a crisis that's led to some, if you will, policy on the run to meet the devastating employment impacts of COVID. But I suppose what we're calling out in the article is really where it's just exchanging one kind of risk for another kind of risk. So, we completely understand the importance of the liquidity challenges that people face currently. I think the risk that we're calling out is sort of a solvency issue and how we think through missing out on those important compounding effects in retirement savings through time.
Yeah, I mean, you can't get back. Look, we haven't figured out a way to turn back time or Mother Nature for that matter. So, I mean, the recipe is, look, you can go riskier, which I think what you're describing in terms of the type of investments. You can make more contributions, but if you could make more contributions, you probably would have been doing it during the pandemic. And you can try to get employers to make more contributions. But hey, by the way, they were impacted by the pandemic as well. And here in the States, over 100,000 small businesses have shuttered and may not come back. I would imagine the same thing applies there in Australia. So, there's only so many levers you can pull, Michael.
No, absolutely. And I think that's the risk now, is that there's this sort of looming lost generation where, as you've just described, particularly for those sort of in sort of their late 40s, early 50s that are in that sort of last decade of full-time work, there's an amazing impact, and it's devastating that we know that there are discrimination in the labour market for workers over 50. So the idea that these folks have lost their jobs now and, typically will accumulate half their balance in the last 10 years of their working life. There's sort of the labour market dislocation, but also discrimination typically against older workers that's documented around the world. And the fact, as you just said, you can't make those additional contributions means that consumption outlook, 10 years down the track looks somewhat troubling.
Yeah. Last week, we had Catherine Gulliday from Charles Schwab, and they had done some survey work on participants. I think they surveyed about 1,000 of them. And they found that the financial stresses were also putting on mental stresses. And as you know, we all know, when you are in a bad frame of mind because you have to pay your bills, you know that you're going to have to work longer, whatever. In addition to the health issues around the pandemic, I would imagine that this has got to be burdensome for many Australians in the situation you're describing.
And the same in the United States and the same around the world. And the other one, we're starting to see some preliminary evidence from our various law enforcement agencies, is the risk of cybercrime, the risk of boiler room type activity spiking, that when people are under financial stress, maybe there are some mental health and other stresses because of finances. We're seeing the rise of, sadly, criminals and organised crime looking at targeting those who might be seeking an 8%, 10%, 12% return. And unfortunately, the combination of everything we've spoken about leads to those sorts of scams being somewhat appealing. So we're certainly seeing in this part of the world law enforcement agencies resourcing up, monitoring and watching for the growth of financial fraud and scams and boiler room type activities as well.
Yeah, and it just means that if you have a loved one who falls into that category, you've got to be vigilant on their behalf. You've got to try to be vigilant on your own behalf. And certainly we rely on public policy and law enforcement to keep us safe as well. The same issue here in the States, Michael. Well, Michael, it's always good checking up with you and hearing about what's happening in the Australian system. We're going to have to keep our eyes glued on this, because this is a big issue, not only in Australia and the United States, but around the globe. Great talking with you. Thanks so much for joining us in the program, and we look forward to having you back very soon.
Stay safe. Thanks, Jeff.
Well, thanks for joining us this morning, Michael. Great to see you. Thanks for sharing your perspective. And when we come back, we'll look at some of the best segments for the week right here on BRN Weekly. Imagine a new television network that will make you richer, healthier, and in control of your financial future. This network is for the policewoman in Nashville, Tennessee, the baker in Dubuque, Iowa, the teacher in Lexington, Kentucky. We want to make the idea of savings and retirement culturally relevant. But what do you see as a defining issue of the midterms? Especially for the smaller businesses. I mean, they are the lifeblood of the American economy. Featuring exclusive interviews, current affairs, and docuseries. 33 years old, you retired early.
The philosophy is money only matters if it helps you live a life that you love.
But you got to start thinking about retirement as soon as you get in.
The Broadcast Retirement Network will drive very high engagement with premium partnerships. So this isn't retirement and savings for your parents or grandparents. This is for all Americans. And we're going to change the way you think about money. Welcome to the next frontier of retirement and savings. This is BRN, the Broadcast Retirement Network.
If you are like 58% of Americans, you didn't go to college. Or you did, but never finished. Maybe it's the thought of a big, intimidating campus. At Independence University, all classes are held online. Maybe it's the thought of being alone in a sea of students. At Independence U, you'll get a personal support team to help you every step of the way. Maybe it's the cost of all those books and supplies. Online means no books to buy. We even give you a new laptop and tablet to keep when you graduate. Maybe your life doesn't fit typical college classes. At Independence U, our online college fits your schedule. Let's meet a few students.
Independence University held my hand through the process.
Don't be afraid to take the leap because it has changed my life drastically.
Just take the first step and you can do it. If I did it, you can do it too.
At IU, there's no barriers to your degree.
800-535-9916.
Welcome back. On Wednesday, I sat down with Deculta's John Epstein and Voya Financial CEO Charles Nelson to dispel some of the myths around the private markets. Let's take a look.
I think one of the myths is that people think of private equity, or that when they hear the term alternatives, they think of high risk IPOs. Oh boy, you're just investing in companies that are just going public, and isn't that high risk, or more risk than a retirement investor should invest in? And there are a wide range of asset classes and types of alternatives, some of which are IPOs, but that's and initial offerings and other types. But that's not necessarily what we're referring to here. What we're referring to in alternatives are appropriate asset classes that, depending on what the manager or the fiduciaries, I should say, are wanting to include, may provide broader diversification than they could otherwise be able to receive, because you have a better or a wider investment opportunity or set to evaluate. The second myth I would point out is around liquidity. And people say, "Oh, geez, don't you have to tie these up for a quarter, a year, and we have to be daily valued in a DC plan?" And while what I think how they're being currently utilized and how they could be utilized, at least initially, are in a well-diversified multi-manager target date or risk-based fund. You could take a portion, a small percentage or a percentage of some sort, into alternatives and include it in there. And so you can deal with part of the liquidity or valuation time period for those, just in terms of the size of the plan and the percentage that you invest in. So it's not necessarily a single fund into itself, obviously. But when you think about that, also think back about participant investors, just what we've been experiencing in COVID since March. We still have seen within Voya 95% of participants not make an investment trade, go from Fund A to Fund B during this time period. So 95% of participants are holding firm in their funds in a pretty highly volatile market and equity time. And if you're thinking of long-term investors, this really fits quite nicely for long-term investors to have a portion of their assets that they may not necessarily need daily valuation to be able to go in and out of the market, because they're not doing that anyway. Certainly, as you get closer to retirement and those retirement where you're drawing down your account, you may want to have more liquidity. But it doesn't necessarily equate to alternatives of private equity to illiquid investments. You got to think of it more broadly than that.
Exactly. I think the DOL and the SEC, are doing this in a methodical way where they're trying to level the playing field. And really what that playing field is the pool of alternative investments or private markets, which is the topic of the DOL letter itself. And what we have seen as an organization, we've conducted our own research in collaboration with the Institute for Private Capital, which is out of UNC Chapel Hill, to really look at what an average investor, how they would have fared if they invested in private markets within a multi-asset framework or a diversified portfolio. And the myths that you were referring to before are clearly dispelled by our results. And we saw that an allocation to private markets clearly enhanced performance of the overall portfolio. We also saw that volatility was clearly minimized when you include an allocation to private markets. And where we were surprised is the diversification benefits. So when we look at risk-adjusted returns, the portfolios that include some type of allocation to private markets clearly did better than those that did not. And also you have to take into account another myth, which is high cost. So when you typically hear private equity or hedge funds, people assume that these are high cost investments, and our results and study were done net of fees. So all of these things and all of these myths that we're hearing in the marketplace from, whether it's plan sponsors or advisors, they can take a look at our study as well as some of the other studies in the industry that have been done, and it clearly supports the investment merit for private markets and DC plans.
In short, yes. I do expect increased activity by asset managers to have and to include various types of alternatives at some percentage in either their risk-based, multi-asset class, multi-manager type, risk-based target date type funds as we go forward. Absolutely.
Yeah, so as an organization and strategically, I think the summary briefs that we're going to be releasing on each of the topics, again, that are outlined in the fiduciary framework as part of the DOL letter is one way to get education out to the whole community. And I think others, when we hold our annual as well as our quarterly meetings, these are times when folks can either dial in or attend in person. This is pre-COVID, of course, where they can listen to really all different topics. So not only investment merits of alts, but also the implementation, the operation aspects of including these private markets in DC plans, and it's ongoing. So this is something where the DOL letter is certainly a great thing to happen, but now the real work is starting, and like Charlie mentioned, and we're clearly gearing up to educate both the alts industry and DC industry on how to accomplish this.
And on Thursday, I sat down with Carrie Hannon, author, columnist, and personal finance expert, about her new book, Great Pajama Jobs. Let's take a look.
It's all about remote working. And the interesting thing is I started this book last summer. So it wasn't even, on the radar that we would all be in this situation right now, working from home remotely. But at that point, even Jeff, remote working was becoming a global movement. I mean, companies were starting to get hip to this idea that, yes, in fact, people could be relied on to do their jobs from their home offices or wherever they may be. And younger workers particularly had been asking for this kind of flexibility in their jobs as well. So we saw this coming, and I started working on pulling together what are some great pajama jobs. And so I can tell you a little bit more about the book as we move forward, but I'm really excited about it because it's a great tool for people right now. Yeah, without question. I want to tell you, quickly, I divided the book into the first part of the book is great jobs, just jobs that, a real smorgasbord, maybe you never thought about, oh my gosh, I could really do that job from home. Because to be honest with you, so many of our jobs can be done remotely. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely love the human connection of being in the office, but there's some really great jobs that you can definitely do from home. Many of these, of course, with a caveat, are white collar jobs. So keep that in mind. These are not customer facing positions, right? The second section of the book is about great employers. And I called 40 employers who have been doing this, and these are global around the world. But hey, you can work for a company that is not in the US or even in your hometown now, right? So that really get it, that have these systems in place to know how to deal with a remote workforce. And the last section is my workshop on, okay, yeah, how do I get one of these jobs? And how do I succeed at being a remote worker? Not everybody is hardwired to do this, right? So that's kind of how I divvied up the book. And so, to dig into a little more advice, what specifically might your listeners be interested in, do you think? So here's what it takes. Truly, the core of it is great communication skills. So you cannot just send emails to people, because we know that words get misinterpreted in that realm, right? You need to pick up the phone sometimes, actually have a phone conversation, or like we're having, talk, a virtual conversation, but where you see the other person and you can kind of read some of the body language signals. You need to set, what is it who you're reporting to, your boss or your manager? How do they like to communicate? Have that conversation with them about what it is they like to do and how they prefer that you reach out to them. I think that you need to be very careful with your time management skills, right? This can be a problem. Either you're overworking, you're not working effectively. Really understand how you work best and how to work without distractions, and really manage your time so that you don't let people intrude on that intricate sort of work-life balance. All of us are struggling with, I don't want people to think I'm slacking off, and it may be because there's this perception that they don't trust you, that they think you're slacking off, that you're not doing your job, that you're out walking your dog, which, actually you should do if you have a dog, to take a break.
Right? That's true.
And that segues into the idea of self-care, because it's all about self-discipline, right? You're disciplined to do your job and have results. You need to tell your manager and your boss, constantly let them know your productivity. I accomplished this today. I am at this point in my project. Constant updates are necessary, but you need that self-care. You need to push away from the computer. You need to go out and take a walk, try to connect with people, maybe in real time if you can, wear your mask, whatever it may be. But do those things. Eat with an eye to nutrition. I know I sometimes forget to eat if I'm on the computer all the time, because there's no one over my shoulder saying, hey, you want to go grab a cup of coffee? Yeah, I think it comes down to the word trust. That's the bottom line. Is many workers and employers feel there's this disconnect. You want to make sure you're on the same page, because you feel a little insecure that maybe they don't understand how much you're putting into it, but when they can't eyeball you. Yeah. And the boss feels the same way, like, I'm not really sure what's happening here. How are they doing their jobs, so forth. So there's this trust factor. The other big issue, so that's why these touch points of communication every day, schedule a couple of touch points where you're connecting. But I think that's a problem. I think for employers moving forward, we're going to see, as people start to return to the office somewhat, they're going to be a hybrid workplace. I mean, definitely the genie's out of the bottle. Remote work is here to stay. It is not going away. And it is a great model for many people and many companies, but there'll be a hybrid model. And so you need to find that sweet spot where everyone trusts each other and understands that we're all doing our best to get this done. For a new employer, a new employee, I mean, if you're ramping into a new job, you're onboarding. Oh my gosh, this is difficult, because part of joining a company is this loyalty, this understanding what that company is and who your coworkers are. And this can be very tricky, because for employers, they want you to understand their culture. They want you to stay with them, to really, have this bond with the employer and believe in their mission. It's a little harder to do remotely, so these take some extra steps.
And that wraps up this episode of BRN Weekly. We're back again tomorrow with our weekly podcast BRN Sunday, I'll be joined by members of the media, academia, and financial services as we look around the globe to analyze all the issues in retirement, markets, technology, personal finance this week. You're not going to want to miss it. So until then, I'm Jeff Snyder. Stay safe, keep on saving, and don't forget, roll with the changes.
Are you being audited and do you owe the IRS $10,000 or more in back taxes? Is the IRS threatening to take more of your money? Don't fight the IRS alone. The Tax Doctor is here to help you negotiate your tax bill and reduce your stress. The IRS can freeze your assets and seize your bank accounts, but you can stop these IRS actions. The Tax Doctor will work with you using our years of experience to represent your case to help you get the best resolution under the IRS guidelines. Help is here to deal with the IRS to reduce your stress. We've handled thousands of cases, so we know what we're doing. If you owe $10,000 or more in back taxes, do not call the IRS alone. Call a Tax Doctor now for a tax emergency analysis.
Call 800-224-6439.